Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 18. The Rise of Khrushchev, 1953 to 1958. Part 7b. The Americans wanted elections first to establish an acceptable central German government, with which a final peace could be made. The creation of two sovereign German states in 1954 made any settlement remote, because the Kremlin insisted that its East German satellite regime, which was not recognized by the United States, must be a party to any settlement and thus be recognized by the United States. This same point became a permanent obstacle, also, to any agreement to unify Berlin, since the United States was willing to negotiate with Russia, but not with East Germany. Eden's own contribution to these discussions was that a demilitarized zone be established along the line of physical contact between East and West in Europe, with international inspection of armed forces in Germany. Suddenly, on the fourth day of the conference, President Eisenhower made a speech which jolted the delegates, and even more the world, out of their casual attention. This was his open skies plan, which never came to anything, but which gave the United States a propaganda advantage the Soviet Union could not overcome. It had two parts: the two superpowers to give to each other a complete blueprint of our military establishments from beginning to end, from one end of our countries to the other, and, next, to provide within our countries facilities for aerial photography to the other country. Nothing could be more repugnant to the ingrained Soviet love of secrecy except full inspection of the country on the ground. But nothing could more clearly show the world that the United States was as frank and honest as its president's own face. Neither had anything to hide. Nothing significant was achieved at the Geneva Conference, but the discussions were conducted in an unprecedented atmosphere of friendly cooperation, which came to be known as the Geneva Spirit, and continued for several years. In fact, it was never completely overcome, even when matters were at their worst, in the weeks following the U-2 incident of May 1960 and the Cuban crises of October 1962. This was because the Soviet Union, having emerged from the isolation imposed on it by Stalin's mania, never returned to it completely, but continued to cooperate with non-communist countries in scientific interchange, athletic events, and social intercourse. From 1955 onward, speakers of Russian and of English were in cooperation somewhere on some project. The most amazing of these projects was the International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 1958, in which scientists of 66 countries cooperated over 18 months to wring from the physical universe of Earth, sea, and Sun some of its secrets. Returned to Moscow from Geneva, Khrushchev abandoned his unwanted quiet and resumed his stalking of Molotov. In September 1955, the harassed foreign minister had to make a public confession of error, admitting that he did not know what point the Soviet Union had reached in its progress along the road to socialism. In February, he had told the Supreme Soviet that the foundations of the socialist society had been built. It now appeared that the society itself was built. Such a mistake, regarded as picayune in the outside world, could inflict almost irreparable damage on a Soviet leader if publicly confessed, as this was. It was a clear indication to other such leaders that Molotov was on the way out. During all this, Khrushchev had held no office in the Soviet government and had functioned only as party leader. But what he did in that capacity was of vital significance. Systematically, he replaced party functionaries on all levels, moving upward those he could depend on and eliminating those he could not trust to support him personally. The other rival leaders in the government knew what was going on, but ignored it since they made the one basic error which could not be remedied. They believed that the government was the ruling structure in the Soviet Union, while Khrushchev, quietly at his work within the party structure, looked forward to the day on which he would demonstrate their error. In February 1956, in what is unquestionably one of the most significant events in the history of communism, Khrushchev lighted one of his sticks of dynamite. The subsequent explosion is still echoing, and the resulting wound to international communism still bleeds freely. Khrushchev's preparation for a party congress was as careful as Stalin's had ever been. It was to be a sounding board for coordinating party policy by speeches to his hand-picked subordinates. In July 1955, the Congress was called for February 14, 1956. At the same time, 2 Khrushchev agents were added to the Presidium, Mikhail Suslov and Igor Kirichenko, and 3 Khrushchev agents were added to the party secretariat, Averky Aristov, Ivan Belayev, and Dmitry Shipilov. The last, who was editor of Pravda, the party newspaper, gave the speech on foreign policy at the Congress. Although Molotov was still foreign minister and was not replaced by Shipilov until August, Aristov soon took over the role Poskrebyshev had previously played for Stalin, in charge of loyalty purges within the party. The 20th Party Congress met for 11 days, February 14th through the 25th, 1956, within the Kremlin walls. Its 1,436 hand-picked delegates formed the oldest Congress which had ever assembled, with 24% over 50 years of age, compared to 15.3% over 50 at the 19th Congress, and only 1.8% over 50 at the 18th Congress of February 1941. These men were fully prepared to support whatever was told them, but none could have anticipated the shocking revelations they would hear. It all began in a rather routine fashion. The first speech of 50,000 words delivered by Khrushchev over 7 hours, 1 hour less than Melenkov's parallel speech in October 1952, was full of factual details. It was notable only for its frequent reference to the urgent need for coexistence with the West and its infrequent use of the name Stalin. The emphasis on coexistence was part of the campaign against Molotov, and, as is usual in communist speeches, was filled with references, by volume and page, to the writings of Lenin. Most of these references proved on examination to be embedded in a context expounding the inevitable clash between communism and capitalism. The delegates, fully trained in such dialectic, had no difficulty in seeing the point. Coexistence was merely a temporary tactic in the larger framework of inevitable struggle. Similar references were made to the possibility of peaceful rather than revolutionary change from capitalism to socialism in single countries. In this case, examples were given: the Baltic states, the East European satellites, and China. The reference to Lenin, Volume 33, pages 57 through 58, made perfectly clear that the peaceful road to socialism could be followed only where a small capitalist state was overrun by a powerful communist neighbor. The chief surprise of the general sessions of the Party Congress was the speech from that old party chameleon, Anastas Mikoyan. It openly criticized Stalin for his disregard of party democracy and his cult of personality, which insisted on personal adulation and on the constant rewriting of party records and Russian history, so that Stalin would always appear as the infallible and clairvoyant leader. The real explosion came at a secret all-night session on July 24th through the 25th, from which all foreign delegates were excluded. Those who listened were warned to take no notes or records. In a speech of 30,000 words, Khrushchev made a horrifying attack on Stalin as a bloodthirsty and demented tyrant who had destroyed tens of thousands of loyal party members on falsified evidence, or no evidence at all, merely to satisfy his own insatiable thirst for power. All the charges which had been made by anti-communists and anti-Stalinists in the 1930s were repeated and driven home with specific details, dates, and names. The full nightmare of the Soviet system was revealed, not as an attribute of the system, which it was, but as a personal idiosyncrasy of Stalin himself, not as the chief feature of communism from 1917, which it was, but only as its chief feature since 1934. And nothing was said of the full collaboration in the process of terror provided to Stalin by the surviving members of the Politburo, led by Khrushchev himself. But all the rest, which the fellow travelers throughout the world had been denying for a generation, poured out: the enormous slave labor camps, the murder of innocent persons by tens of thousands, the wholesale violation of law, the use of fiendishly planned torture to exact confessions for acts never done, or to involve persons who were completely innocent, the ruthless elimination of whole classes and of whole nations, such as the army officers, the kulaks, and the Kalmuk, Chechen, Ingush, and Bolkar minority groups. The servility of writers, artists, and everyone else, including all party members, to the tyrant was revealed, along with the total failure of his agricultural schemes, his cowardice and incompetence in the war, his insignificance in the early history of the party, and his constant rewriting of history to conceal these things. A few passages from this speech will indicate its tone. Quote, Stalin's negative characteristics, which in Lenin's time were only beginning, changed in his last years in a grave abuse of power, which caused untold harm to the party. Stalin acted not through persuasion, explanation, and patient cooperation with people, but by imposing his ideas and by demanding complete submission to his opinion. Whoever opposed this or tried to argue his own point of view was doomed to be purged and to subsequent moral and physical annihilation. Stalin originated the concept enemy of the people, a term which made it unnecessary to prove the ideological errors of the victim. It made it possible to use the cruelest repression and utmost illegality against anyone who disagreed in any way with Stalin, against those who were only suspected or had been subjects of rumors. This concept, enemy of the people, eliminated any possibility of ideological fight or of rebuttal. Usually, the only evidence used against all the rules of modern legal science was the confession of the accused, and, as subsequent investigation showed, such confessions were obtained by physical pressure on the accused. The formula, enemy of the people, was specifically introduced for the purpose of physically annihilating these persons. He abandoned the method of ideological struggle for administrative violence, mass repressions, and terror. Lenin used such methods only against actual class enemies and not against those who blunder or err, and whom it is possible to lead through theory and even retain as leaders. Stalin so elevated himself above the party and above the state that he ceased to consider either the Central Committee or the party. The number of arrests based on charges of counter-revolutionary crimes increased tenfold from 1936 to 1937. When the cases of some of these so-called spies and saboteurs were examined, it was found that all their cases were fabricated. Confessions of guilt of many were gained by cruel and inhuman tortures. Comrade Rutzetak, candidate member of the Politburo, party member from 1905, who spent 10 years in a Tsarist hard labor camp, completely retracted in court the confession which had been forced from him. This retraction was ignored, in spite of the fact that Rutzetak had been chief of the Party Central Control Commission established by Lenin to ensure party unity. He was not even called before the Central Committee's Politburo because Stalin refused to talk to him. Sentence was pronounced in a trial of 20 minutes, and he was shot. After careful re-examination of the case in 1955, it was established that the accusation against Rutzetak was false and based on falsified evidence. The way in which the NKVD manufactured fictitious anti-Soviet centers and blocs can be seen in the case of Comrade Rosenblum, party member from 1906, who was arrested in 1937 by the Leningrad NKVD. He was subjected to terrible torture, during which he was ordered to confess false information about himself and other persons. He was then brought to the office of Zhukovsky, who offered him freedom on condition that he make before the court a false confession fabricated in 1937 by the NKVD concerning sabotage, espionage, and subversion in a terroristic center in Leningrad. With unbelievable cynicism, Zhukovsky told about the method for the creation of fabricated anti-Soviet plots. You yourself, said Zhukovsky, will not need to invent anything. The NKVD will prepare for you an outline for every branch of the center. You will have to study it carefully and to remember well all questions and answers which the court may ask. Your future will depend on how the trial goes and on its results. If you manage to endure it, you will save your head, and we will feed and clothe you at the government's expense until your death. The NKVD prepared lists of persons whose cases were before the military tribunal and whose sentences were prepared in advance. Yezhov would send these lists to Stalin personally for his approval of the punishments. In 1937 to 1938, such lists of many thousands of party, government, communist, youth, army, and economic workers were sent to Stalin. He approved those lists. Stalin was a very distrustful man, morbidly suspicious. We knew this from our work with him. He would look at a man and say, "Why are your eyes so shifty today?" Or, "Why are you turning so much today? And why do you avoid looking at me directly?" This sickly suspicion created in him distrust of eminent party workers he had known for years. Everywhere and in everything he saw enemies, two-facers, and spies. How is it possible that a person confesses to crimes which he has not committed? Only in one way: by application of physical pressure, tortures, bringing him to a state of unconsciousness, deprivation of his judgment, taking away of his human dignity. In this way were confessions obtained. Only a few days before the present Congress, we called to the Central Committee Presidium and interrogated the investigative judge Rodos, who in his time investigated and interrogated Kosyor, Chubar, and Kosarev. He is a vile person, with the brain of a bird, and morally completely degenerate, and it was this man who was deciding the fate of prominent party workers. He told us, "I was told that Kosyar and Chubar were people's enemies, and for that reason I, as investigative judge, had to make them confess that they are enemies. I thought that I was executing the orders of the party." The secret speech also destroyed Stalin's reputation as a military genius. Quote, "During the war and afterward, Stalin said that the tragedy experienced by the nation in the early days of the war resulted from the unexpected attack by the Germans. But, comrades, this is completely untrue. By April 3rd, 1941, Churchill, through his ambassador to the USSR, Krips, personally warned Stalin that the Germans were regrouping their armed units to attack the Soviet Union. Churchill stressed this repeatedly in his dispatches of April 18 and in the following days. Stalin took no heed of these warnings. Moreover, he warned that no credence be given to information of this sort in order not to provoke the beginning of military operations. Information of this kind on German invasion of Soviet territory was coming in from our own military and diplomatic sources. Despite these particularly grave warnings, the necessary steps were not taken to prepare the country properly for defense and to prevent it from being caught unawares. Did we have time and resources for such preparation? Yes, we did. Our industry was fully capable of supplying everything the Soviet army needed. Had our industry been mobilized properly and in time to supply the army, our wartime losses would have been decidedly smaller. On the eve of the invasion, a German citizen crossed our border and stated that the German armies had orders to start their offensive on the night of June 22nd at 3 a.m. Stalin was informed of this immediately, but even this was ignored. As you see, everything was ignored. The result was that in the first hours and days the enemy destroyed in our border regions a large part of our air force, artillery, and other equipment. He annihilated large numbers of our soldiers and disorganized our military leadership. Consequently, we could not prevent the enemy from marching deep into the country. Very grievous consequences, especially at the beginning of the war, followed Stalin's destruction of many military commanders and political workers during 1937 to 1941. Because of his suspiciousness and false accusations, during that time, the leaders who had gained military experience in Spain and in the Far East were almost completely liquidated. After the first severe disaster and defeats at the front, Stalin thought that this was the end. He said, "All that which Lenin created we have lost forever." After this, Stalin for a long time actually did not direct the military operations and ceased to do anything whatever. Therefore, the danger which hung over our fatherland in the first period of the war was largely due to the faulty methods of directing the nation and the party by Stalin himself. Later, the nervousness and hysteria which Stalin showed, interfering with actual military operations, caused our army serious damage. He was very far from any understanding of the real situation which was developing on the front. This was natural, for in the whole war he never visited any section of the front or any liberated city. When a very serious situation developed for our army in the Kharkov region in 1942, we decided to give up an operation seeking to encircle Kharkov to avoid fatal consequences if the operation continued. Contrary to sense, Stalin rejected our suggestion and issued orders to continue the operation. I telephoned to Stalin at his villa, but he refused to answer the phone, and Melenkov was on the receiver. I stated for a second time that I wanted to speak to Stalin personally about the grave situation at the front, but Stalin did not consider it convenient to raise the phone and insisted that I must speak to him through Melenkov, although he was only a few steps away. After listening in this fashion to our plea, Stalin said, "Let everything remain as it is." What was the result of this? The worst that we had expected. The Germans surrounded our army concentrations, and we lost hundreds of thousands of our soldiers. This is Stalin's military genius, and what it cost us. After this party congress, we shall have to reevaluate our military operations and present them in their true light. After our great victory, which cost us so much, Stalin began to belittle many of the commanders who contributed to the victory, because Stalin excluded every possibility that victories at the front should be credited to anyone but himself. He began to tell all kinds of nonsense about Zhukov. He popularized himself as a great leader and tried to inculcate in the people the idea that all victories won in the war were due to the courage, daring, and genius of Stalin and no one else. Let us take, for instance, our historical and military films and some written works. They make us feel sick. Their real purpose is the propagation of the theme of Stalin as a military genius. Remember the film, The Fall of Berlin. Here, only Stalin acts. He issues orders in a hall in which there are many empty chairs, and only one man approaches him and reports to him. That is Poskrebyshev, his loyal shield-bearer. Where is the military command? Where is the Politburo? Where is the government? What are they doing? There is nothing about them in the film. Stalin acts for everybody. He pays no attention to them. He asks no one for advice. Where are the military who bear the burden of war? They are not in the film. With Stalin in, there is no room for them. You see to what Stalin's delusions of grandeur led. He had completely lost consciousness of reality. One characteristic example of Stalin's self-glorification and of his lack of elementary modesty was his short biography published in 1948. It is an expression of most dissolute flattery, making a man into a god, transforming him into an infallible sage, the greatest leader and most sublime strategist of all times and nations. No other words could be found to raise Stalin to the heavens. We need not give examples of the loathsome adulation filling this book. They were all approved and edited by Stalin personally, and some of them were added in his own handwriting to the draft of the book. He added, although he performed his task of leader of the party and the people with consummate skill and enjoyed the unreserved support of the whole Soviet people, Stalin never allowed his work to be marred by the slightest hint of vanity, conceit, or self-adulation. I'll cite one more insertion made by Stalin. The advanced Soviet science of war received further development at Comrade Stalin's hands. He elaborated the theory of the permanently operating factors that decide the issue of wars. Comrade Stalin's genius enabled him to divine the enemy's plans and defeat them. The battles in which Comrade Stalin directed the Soviet armies are brilliant examples of operational military skill. All those who interested themselves even a little in the national situation saw the difficult situation in agriculture, but Stalin never even noticed it. Did we tell Stalin about this? Yes, we told him, but he did not support us. Why? Because Stalin never traveled anywhere, did not meet city or farm workers. He did not know the actual situation in the provinces. He knew the country and agriculture only from films, and these films had dressed up and beautified the existing situation in agriculture. They so pictured collective farm life that the tables were bending from the weight of turkeys and geese. Stalin thought it was actually so. Stalin proposed that the taxes paid by the collective farms and by their workers should be raised by 40 billion rubles. According to him, the peasants are well off, and the collective farm worker would need sell only one more chicken to pay his tax in full. Imagine what this meant. Certainly, 40 billion rubles is a sum greater than everything the collective farmers obtained for all the products they sold to the state. In 1952, for instance, the collective farms and their workers received 26,280 million rubles for all their products sold to the government. The proposal was not based on an actual assessment of the situation, but on the fantastic ideas of a person divorced from reality. It was inconceivable that this extraordinary speech could be kept a secret, in spite of all the warnings at its delivery that it must be. Versions of it, some of them softened, were sent out by the Kremlin to foreign party leaders. One of these found its way to the United States government and was published on June 2, 1956. There is not the slightest doubt that the speech is authentic and that almost everything it says is true. But the mystery remains. Why did the Kremlin leaders decide to speak thus on a situation which every student of the subject knew, at least partially, but which could still be denied so long as it was not admitted? One factor in the making of the speech was undoubtedly the determination of the army to clear itself of the unjust accusations made against its officers in 1937 to 1941, and against the effort to attribute the disasters of 1941 to 1942 to professional incompetence. Just as the German generals after 1945 wanted to blame their defeats on Hitler, so the Russian generals, with much greater justification, wanted to blame their early defeats on Stalin. But there undoubtedly must have been other causes, of which we are not yet aware. The anti-Stalin speech, like the admission of error in the alienation from Tito, inevitably had an injurious influence on communism throughout the world, especially in the satellite powers, and ultimately became the ideological basis for the splitting of these powers into Stalinist and anti-Stalinist groupings, led by Red China and the Soviet Union. Certain points about this speech are noteworthy. In the first place, all the criticism of Stalin is directed at his actions subsequent to 1934. These are criticized, not because they were vile in themselves, but because they were injurious to the party and to loyal party members. Throughout this speech, as in everything else he did in this period, Khrushchev was working to strengthen the party. Moreover, by directing his criticism at Stalin personally, he exculpated himself and the other Bolshevik survivors who were fully as guilty as Stalin was, guilty not merely because they acquiesced in Stalin's atrocities from fear, as Khrushchev admitted in the speech, but because they fully cooperated with him. A study of Khrushchev's own life shows that he supported Stalin's atrocities fully at the time, often anticipated them, benefited personally from them, and egged Stalin on to greater ones. In fact, even as Khrushchev in his speech condemned Stalin's acts, which caused the deaths of thousands in the party, he defended Stalin's acts which caused the deaths of millions in the country. The fault was not merely with Stalin. It was with the system, and even wider than that, it was with Russia. Any system of human life which is based on autocracy and authority, as Russian life has always been, will turn up sadistic monsters, as Russia has throughout its history, again and again. And the more completely total and irresponsible power is concentrated in one man's hands, the more frequently will a monster of sadism be produced. The very structure of Russian life on the authoritarian lines it had always possessed drove Khrushchev, as it had driven Stalin 30 years before, to concentrate all power in his own hands. Neither man could relax halfway to power, for fear that someone else would continue on, seeking the peak of power. The basis of the whole system was fear, and like all neurotic drives in a neurotic system, such fear could not be overcome, even by achievement of total power. That is why it grows into paranoia, as it did with Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Paul I, Stalin, and others. During all the struggle for power with the Kremlin, foreign affairs were still actively pursued by the Soviet leaders. The chief event was a change in direction from Europe to Asia, which took place in the spring of 1955. The Austrian Treaty, the reconciliation with Tito, the stalemate over the German problem, the Warsaw Pact, and the Geneva Spirit were all parts of a plan to put Europe on ice in order to shift attention to Southeast Asia, to India, and to the Near East. This new direction was opened by beginning arms shipments to Colonel Gamal Nasser of Egypt in the spring of 1955, and reached its peak in the so-called Suez Crisis of October 1956. A similar effort in India, seeking to win its support for the Soviet bloc, began with the state visit to India and Burma by Bulganin and Khrushchev in November 1955. This new direction and its consequences will be described in a moment, but it must be recognized that the continuing struggle for control within the Kremlin and the satellite states ran parallel with the growing crises in the Near East, and that both reached the critical stage at the same time in October 1956. The struggle between the Stalinists and the anti-Stalinists within the satellite states, and the discontent of the inhabitants with both groups, kept public affairs agitated along the whole zone of satellite areas, from the Baltic to the Balkans. Khrushchev's secret speech increased this agitation. Pressure on Khrushchev inside the Kremlin to reverse his professed policy of de-Stalinization grew. Khrushchev struck back. On June 2nd, 1956, the same day that Tito arrived for a state visit to Moscow, Molotov was removed as foreign minister and replaced by Khrushchev's agent, Shipalov, the editor of Pravda. But the satellite turmoil continued. This turmoil, which agitated Eastern Europe for many years, may be regarded as a series of clashes between Stalinism and Tetoism. Neither of these is an extreme pole of dualistic opposition, but rather two positions on a number of scales, concerned rather with methods than with goals. Both have as a goal their creation of powerful and prosperous communist systems, but they do not agree on methods, or rather on the relative mixture of methods to be used to reach their goal. Each sees industrialization as necessary to such a goal, but Tito is perhaps necessarily more willing to use foreign investment and foreign technical guidance if these are free from any political control. Stalinism in general distrusts all foreign help as spying. Relying on domestic capital accumulation and determined to raise it speedily, Stalinism puts severe pressures on the peasantry and thus emphasizes collective farms under political pressure, while Tetoism is prepared to make much more use of private agriculture and of economic incentives for food production. This entails a slower rate of industrialization and more emphasis on improved standards of living. There are also other more pervasive differences. Stalinism insists on uniformity and centralized authority, while Tetoism is more willing to allow diversity and collegial control. This, in their terms, is the distinction between a monolithic bloc and collective leadership. When the monolithic bloc is subject to criticism, it is called the cult of personality. In the satellites, for historical reasons, there are other sharp distinctions between Stalinism and Tetoism. The former favors Russian domination, while the latter favors local nationalism. As a consequence, in 1945 to 1960, the former favored those local leaders who had spent the pre-war and war periods in exile in the Soviet Union, while the latter favored the underground fighters who had stayed at home in the left-wing resistance groups. And finally, the Stalinists upheld their road to socialism as the only road, while the Tetoists contended there were many roads to socialism. As might be expected, political oppression and the rule of the monolithic party was associated with the one point of view, while a greater readiness to allow diversity of outlook and coalition regimes mark the other. There is no doubt that Stalin intended to establish a fully Stalinist system, as just described in Eastern Europe, the zone, as Seton Watson calls it. But this could not be done immediately in the chaos of war's ending. Accordingly, a period of real coalition regimes was established based on the association of all groups and parties which had resisted Nazism. Most of these groups were made up of peasants, workers, and intellectuals, led by a combination of exiles back from Russia and hardened resistance fighters. One of the chief acts of these coalition regimes in most countries was agrarian reform, that is, the division of former large estates into the hands of peasant owners. Within a few years, and in most cases by 1948, this coalition was broken down and replaced by narrow Stalinist control, governed by a typical Stalinist tyranny. This was achieved by getting the significant government posts into the hands of hardcore Stalinists, usually the former Moscow exiles, and forcing other groups out of the coalition. In this process, the presence of Soviet troops was often the vital factor. Along with this went a social, economic, and propagandist campaign to split the farmers by calling the more affluent, better educated, and more obstinate ones agrarian reactionaries and enemies of the people. These were liquidated, frequently by death. The chief index showing that this stage had been reached was usually a reversal of the agricultural policy from agrarian reform to collectivization, similar to that achieved in Russia in 1930 to 1934. As one consequence of this change, each satellite found its welfare, especially in economics, subordinated to that of the Soviet Union.